Okay, so we're just going to have a quick look at what even is variation today. And then next lesson, we will look at sexual reproduction as a way of causing variation. Then we will look at mutations and what happens during sexual reproduction to cause mutation, and then fertilization as well. So today we're just going to look at like what is variation. So the definition, because as we know now, definitions are super important and you should be getting all these definitions down. So variation is the phenotypic differences within a species that reproduce sexually. So in a species that reproduce sexually, i.e. combines genetic information from two parents to make a unique individual, provides individuals that look different from each other. So phenotypically means they look different from each other. So variation or differences in traits is caused by two things: genetic factors, so what you're actually born with, that's what you've inherited. So key word there, inherited, and we looked at inheritance in the second third of this topic with Punnett squares, pedigrees, all of that. But also can be caused by environmental factors as well. So two things that can contribute to variation. However, only genetic differences, so ones that were actually inherited, could be passed on to the next generation. So if it's an environmental factor, then you cannot pass it on. So like we've already looked at, humans, although we've got the same set of genes in all of us, we've got different combinations of alleles for those genes, except for twins, which is what causes this variation. So it depends on what our genotype is for every single gene, depends on what it would look like. So let's have a look at inherited variation. So inherited, i.e. can be passed on. So inherited variation can be passed through generations and can be coded for in our genes. So it is in the base sequence of our genes. We've got the alleles that we can pass on into our gametes, and when they fuse with someone else's gamete, to make offspring. So we can pass on anything that is coded for in our genes. However, non-inheritable, or what we just called it as environmental variation, is things that are acquired during our lifetime that we can't pass on. So like food, lack of food, so maybe you're really skinny because you don't eat, or the opposite, you're quite big because you eat a lot. You can't pass that on to your kids. Obviously there's some examples of people who are genetically skinnier or bigger than other people, but depending on your diet, you're not going to pass that on to your kids. Tanning, if you fake tan, or if you never go out in the sun, you're not going to pass that on to your kids either. You also wouldn't pass on scars, so if you've got any scars on your body from where you've hurt yourself, that won't be passed on to your children either. So likewise, neither would like skin cancer, where you've got a genetic change, but it's only in like a skin cell, so it's not going to be passed on in the gametes. So things that are in somatic cells, there's a new word there, it just means body cells, can't be passed on in gametes because it's not encoded for in the genes. So if a genetic change is in your genes, it can be passed on. If it's not at all in your genes, it's quite like surface level, literally, then it can't be passed on. Two ways to classify variation. Continuous variation, so if we were going to graph this, it'd kind of look like this, where you've got a range of phenotypes like height. So if we put everyone in our class in height order, we'd have a range like this. Skin color is a range, weight, those sort of things, quite a range of those. Discontinuous means it's not continual, so you can't have a range anymore. If I was going to graph this, it would look like a bar graph, for example. So like blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, hazel eyes. You fit in one group or the other. We can't really have like a range or a spectrum of these phenotypes. You're in one group or you're in the other. Brown hair, blonde hair, your different groups for these. Like we've looked at in the SciPad, rat fur colour, they either had black fur or they had white fur. There wasn't a grey sort of option. So some other examples here, dimples or no dimples, you can roll your tongue or you can't roll your tongue. So either or traits, not a range, whereas continuous is a range of different phenotypes. Typically, discontinuous variation comes from one gene that controls that, with a dominant or a recessive allele. So that's like more what we're looking at this year. Whereas continuous variation is typically coded for by quite a few genes that are working together, as well as the environment influencing it, a whole range of factors, just turning on genes, turning off genes, quite a bit more complex than what we're looking at this year. So pretty much every question we'll be looking at will be about discontinuous traits. You're either one thing or you're the other. Okay, let's have a look at this question from 2017. Okay, so leopards in the wild, so here's our leopard here, commonly have scars, especially around their faces. Explain why leopard cubs can be born with black coats, but they can't be born with scars. So here we've got our like spotted leopard, so maybe that's like dominant, maybe black coats, maybe like recessive. It doesn't really matter because that's not what the question's asking about. It's asking about why is fur colour inheritable? Why can that be passed on from a mum and dad to their offspring, but scars can't? So even if this leopard's gotten a lot of fights, has a lot of scars, you can see them all there, why can't she pass them on to her offspring? Okay, so first of all, I'd start with defining variation, which they haven't. But anyway, inheritable variation can be passed on to offspring. It must be encoded for in the DNA. That's what I'm looking for here, encoded for in the DNA. Whereas non-inheritable variation may be due to the environment. So it affects that organism only and not its offspring. So the black coloration of leopard's coat is due to DNA differences. So you can really see the key point here is it's encoded for in DNA, which means it can be passed on. However, injury or fighting has caused the scars to form, which does not change the DNA, so we can't pass it on. That means it's non-inheritable. Whereas the black colour was a change in the DNA, so you could actually pass that on, a different base sequence. Think back to the first third of this topic we were looking at. Scars affect areas of the leopard's body, but it doesn't affect its DNA or the gametes, so it can't be passed on. So obviously the key thing here is, does it change the DNA that would be going into the gametes, or does it only change just the physical appearance of the organism?